Chapter 23. On a quiet afternoon in April 1944, not long before we left Bombay, we suddenly heard a loud explosion, and a half hour or so later, the sound of another shattering detonation shook the ground beneath our feet and set us nervously speculating about what might have occurred. Foremost in everyone's mind was the fear that a Japanese invasion of India had begun. We eventually discovered that the SS Fort Stikine, a freighter carrying more than 1,000 tons of explosives, including several tons of sensitive A explosives, torpedoes, mines, and other munitions, had blown up. It had also carried Spitfire aircraft, timber, scrap iron, and gold bullion bars in 31 crates, and had sailed in from Birkenhead via Gibraltar and Port Said to the port of Karachi, where it was further loaded with 87,000 raw cotton bales and several barrels of oil. Alexander James Naismith, the captain, objected to such a mix of cargo and stated that it had just about everything that will either burn or blow up. His concerns went unheeded. The vessel sailed into Bombay Harbour and anchored at the Victoria Dock on the 12th of April. 2 days later, the freighter had not yet been unloaded when the crew was alerted to a fire that had developed in the hold. All efforts to contain it failed, as dense smoke made it impossible to locate the source. The huge quantity of water that had been pumped into the ship to quell the flames bubbled and boiled in the ensuing inferno. After almost 2 hours of desperate attempts, the order to abandon ship was given, and minutes later a massive explosion rocked the bay, splitting the freighter in two and spewing burning material over a large area in the vicinity, setting fire to slums, sinking 13 merchant ships and 30 dhows that had been harbored nearby. Half an hour later, another explosion created more havoc and endangered those who had rushed in to help. Terrified people could be seen fleeing around the area, some rushing up past our home on Malabar Hill. More than 800 people lost their lives, including Captain Naismith. Many days later, some people, to their delight, discovered bits of gold bullion on the terraces of their homes, while others, to their horror, discovered gruesomely charred remains of human torsos or limbs. There was much excitement at St. Xavier's High School, which was the school that my brothers Eunice and Arthur attended, when it was discovered that after the students had returned to their homes at the end of the school day, a red-hot piece of propeller had landed in the compound. The enormity of the disaster and their own miraculous escape became clear to the boys when they realized that their school had been impacted, even though it was 3 miles away from the site of the explosion. Today, the propeller, a grim reminder of that event, can be seen on the grounds of St. Xavier's School in Bombay. At the time, due to wartime censorship, most of the people in Bombay, including ourselves, knew little of what had actually happened and of the extent of the losses that had occurred. It wasn't till 2 months later that the rest of the world finally heard a little of what had happened. But the cinematographer, Sudhish Ghatak, who had filmed a movie of the event, was not allowed to make it public. In fact, it was said that the film reel had been initially confiscated by the military, and it was only very much later that parts of it were shown as a newsreel. About a month later, and quite unrelated to this event, Germany surrendered, and people became hopeful that soon the war that still raged in the Pacific would also end. Japan, determined to rule the world, fought on against the Allied forces, despite the fact that with the Nazi threat eliminated, Britain and its allies were now able to concentrate all their efforts against them. The designing and building of the atomic bomb had already begun in 1939, and a race against Germany's completion of this project had enabled scientists, which included Oppenheimer, in the United States to finish the job by early 1945. With this nuclear weapon in their arsenal, the United States called for the surrender of Japan in the Potsdam Declaration on July 26, 1945, and threatened prompt and utter destruction if it did not comply. Rebuffed by the Japanese, who considered this to be an empty threat, the United States dropped a uranium gun-type atomic bomb, devastating Hiroshima on the 6th of August, and then a plutonium implosion-type bomb on Nagasaki 3 days later. Of more than 200,000 people who lost their lives, the majority were civilians who died from flash or flame burns, radiation sickness, falling debris, and other injuries. The horror of what had occurred shocked the world and shattered the morale of the Japanese, who capitulated and signed the instrument of surrender on the 2nd of September 1945. The debate as to whether the dropping of the atomic bombs was necessary to end the war has been going on for decades. Some Japanese argue that it was not the bombs that caused Japan to surrender, but rather Russia's threat to invade Hokkaido. Those arguing in favor of the dropping of the bombs state that even more lives would have been lost of both the enemy and the Allies if the bombs had not been dropped and the war had been further prolonged. The Chinese, who survived the Suk Ching massacre in Singapore after the British defeat, would not have had it any other way. They remember when Chinese males between the ages of 18 and 50 were branded with square ink marks on their arms to indicate they were examined, and with triangular ink marks if they were to be executed. They were brutally eliminated by the Japanese in tens of thousands, and some witnessed their entire families, including women and children, systematically run through one by one with bayonets. The Second World War was purported to be a war to end all wars, and for a while we all believed it. Shortly after we heard that the war was over, we had a full house with Chotima and Chotabaji, who arrived with their children, our cousins, all 9 of them, and who roughly corresponded in age to us. The girls were Aisha, Hawa, Fafa, Sarah, Zohra, and Rabia, and the boys Khalid, Usman, and Harun. They had attempted to trek through the jungles of Burma, carrying a hoard of banknotes in Indian currency which they had stuffed into mattresses. Many other people benefited from having hidden stacks of Indian rupees during the occupation rather than destroying it as they were required to do upon the retreat of the British. This money had become worthless in Burma because it had been replaced by Japanese currency. But the journey for Chotabaji and his family became treacherous, and they turned back before they got very far. They had held on to the money and now brought it with them to Bombay, and Chotima handed out 100 rupee notes to each of us on Eid Day, which our mother promptly took and redistributed it to Chotima's children. Chapter 24. Toward the end of our stay in Bombay, major operations were underway for the upcoming Diamond Jubilee celebrations of the Aga Khan, who was an important figure not only for the global Ismaili community, but also had considerable political stature. He was the first president of the All India Muslim League, and though he resigned that position in 1912, he remained influential in its policies. We listened in awe as Qayyum told us what would happen during these celebrations. He said that this was going to be the Aga Khan's Diamond Jubilee, and that his father had told him that the last time there had been a celebration, it had been the Aga Khan's Golden Jubilee. Now, he said, the man had gained even more weight, and this was a good thing for the Ismailis, because the Aga Khan would be placed on one pan of a weighing scale, and the other pan would be balanced by piling on a whole lot of diamonds, till the scale was totally balanced. We listened to his narration of how the events would unfold and envisioned a giant weighing scale with the Aga Khan precariously standing on one side in a large circular brass tray as piles of sparkling diamonds were being loaded onto the tray suspended on the other side. He told us that these diamonds would then be used to help the Ismaili community throughout the world. Then Qayyum lowered his voice and almost whispered to us that a lot of what they did in their place of worship, which they called the Jamaat Khana, was secret, and that they even danced in there, clashing sticks together and clapping their hands and singing. I thought it sounded like a lot of fun and asked if I could join them, but Qayyum said no, that would be possible because they didn't allow non-Ismailis to enter, and he said, in any case, I wouldn't want to be there when the Aga Khan came to visit the place because, and then Qayyum paused, looked at my hair which wasn't very long, then continued to tell us that the Aga Khan trampled over the tresses of countless damsels. These, he said, were young girls who in his honor piously lay down on either side of the long path, spreading their hair on the ground for him to walk on. Much later I discovered that the Ismailis are one of the Shia sects of Islam and claimed that the descent of their leader is from the family of the Quraysh of Arabia. The community most prominent in Bombay at the time of the Diamond Jubilee were Nizari Ismailis, who believed the Aga Khan to be the 48th Imam and the direct descendant of the Prophet Muhammad's daughter Fatima and her husband Ali, who also happened to be her second cousin. The distinguishing factor between Shia and Sunni Muslims is that the former believe in the family and descendants of Muhammad as divinely chosen, while the latter do not. There was much excitement about the expected arrival of 600,000 carats of diamonds from London, which gave the estimated weight of the Aga Khan as 265 pounds. Panic ensued when a few days before the event, it was discovered that the ship that was supposed to arrive in Bombay with the precious stones had by mistake been diverted to Basra in Iraq. For a short while it was debated whether glass gems should be used instead, but to the relief of everyone concerned, it was soon reported that the speedboat had picked up the diamonds from Basra and had arrived in Bombay via Karachi just in time for the celebrations. Ismailis from all over the world had congregated in Bombay to mark the occasion, and an Ismaili family whom my parents knew back in Burma came to stay with us for the duration. The couple were in their early 50s and were accompanied by their daughter, who seemed to be in her early 20s, and their son, who was only 6. They stayed with us for several days. Both the women were tall and slender and wore the typical Burmese angies and longies. The daughter seemed to be slow in her responses, especially in contrast to the little boy who ran around the apartment, climbed onto and jumped off chairs, and chatted incessantly. Unfortunately, most of his words were punctuated with expletives, and his mother, embarrassed by his behavior, threatened that she would cut off his tongue. It didn't help. In fact, it caused him to have nightmares about it, and he woke up screaming that his tongue was being cut off. He discovered ice cream for the first time in his life when he arrived in Bombay, and held a piece of ice in his hand, briefly holding it up against the light, and peered into its glass-like transparency before quickly popping it into his mouth. His eyes closed in an expression of pure ecstasy as he felt its coolness on his tongue and palate, and then, biting down upon it, opened his eyes in amazement as it broke into pieces and melted in his mouth. He developed such an affinity for it that soon he was crunching ice at every opportunity, and coveted it so much that he attempted to hide some of it in his suitcase one day. Later, when he went to withdraw the ice from his secret hoard, he found nothing there but a wet patch, and becoming certain that someone had stolen it, he threw a fit and swore profusely. Shortly after the Jubilee celebrations and immediately after the Japanese occupation of Burma came to an end, Papaji returned to Kalore to check on the situation there. I remember even now missing him and pestering my mother every day with questions about when he would be back. Then a letter arrived, and what I remember most are the words that stated that nothing remained in the house, not even a broom or a needle. In my mind, I envisioned a large empty house with a broom in one corner and a needle hidden in a puffball of dust, which were now no longer there, but had to be created in the image I held in my mind before they could be gone. I had no memory of the home we had left behind, but some of it must have lain buried in my subconscious, because the floors of the house that I had imagined were chocolate brown hardwood and quite accurately replicated the actual floors of the upstairs bedrooms of our house when I finally saw them. When Papaji finally returned to Bombay, preparations were started immediately for our return to Kalor. Return to Burma, Chapter 25. All kinds of interesting things were packed into trunks for our trip home. Several mattresses, blankets, and pillows were laid out and tucked into army-tight khaki bedrolls made of canvas, which were then rolled up tightly and secured with thick brown leather straps and metal buckles. What I remember most, though, is the large doll with shiny pink skin, which was smooth and cool against my cheek and smelled of new plastic. I had been longing for a doll for a very long time. In fact, on one occasion, I had gone to the store with my brother Arthur when I was about 6 and he was probably 12. There, displayed among all the countless articles in the shop, was a rack with a bunch of plastic dolls suspended from it. I decided I had to have one of them and insisted my brother purchase it for me. He certainly didn't have the money to buy it, but I didn't understand that. I just knew we were in a place where what I wanted was right there and could think of no reason why I shouldn't have it. I cried and stamped my feet and tantrumed all the way home, to the embarrassment of my poor brother. Now I finally had what I longed for. It was this large pink plastic doll with a painted face and painted hair. I would have preferred a doll with eyes that opened and closed and one that had real hair, but I was happy with what I got. I didn't have a chance to play with it immediately, though, because it was quickly packed away in one of the trunks, with all the other things, including small gray-green plastic soldiers for my younger brother Farooq. I had never seen a soldier before, and to me, these were stiff, odd-looking toys, costumed and strangely menacing. These were reminders of the war, which everyone wished had never happened and would rather forget. I never saw Farooq playing with them, and in fact I never saw them again after they had been packed into the trunk. The smell of the plastic of those soldiers was different from the scent of the doll, which I smothered in talcum powder once it was taken out of the trunk in Kalor. The new metal trunks smelled strongly of the shiny black paint they were coated with, and were carried on the heads of a long line of coolies who walked with them to the train station in Bombay. The next thing I recall was the long ride to Calcutta by train, where we boarded a steamship and sailed across the Bay of Bengal toward Rangoon. We spent the next 3 days sleeping in the hold, surrounded by all our belongings. I remember the smell of boiled potatoes and vegetables wafting into the hold from the ship's kitchen, blanketing the scent of the salty sea air. At first, Yasin plied us with oranges, telling us that it was to prevent us from getting seasick. But finally, he too succumbed to the rolling of the ship and became more seasick than any of us. The water of the sea was inky blue and froth white where it struck the side of the ship. And I don't know where I was on the ship, but at one point I was so close to the water I could have touched it. After 3 days of sailing across the Bay of Bengal, we finally arrived at the river port of Rangoon and entered through the busy customs terminal. Many people had arrived, mostly Indians who had left when the war broke out. There was a sense of excitement in the air, of a promise, of a return to normalcy, of picking up where they had left off. Those who had lived in Burma for more than a generation or two, it felt like they were returning to their homeland. India had felt foreign and they were glad to be back. Our baggage was checked by a tall British customs officer who wondered where we had purchased the beautiful football we had brought with us. It was handcrafted and smelt of new tan leather that covered the inflatable inner tube of pigskin. It was not unusual for customs officers to admire a particular item that travelers brought into the country. This was their way of indicating which article they would accept for themselves by way of a bribe to expedite the clearance of the rest of the luggage. My father laughed and explained that we had got it from the Amul butter coupons, which we had collected, and that he needed the football because he already had the football team. The customs officer looked at us and smiled, then without much fuss cleared our luggage and we left the dock. The Amul coupons had an interesting story. The coupons started out as a marketing ploy of Amul to break the monopoly that Polson butter had in India. The latter brand marketed its butter and coffee to British, Indian, and American forces and had opened a new office in Bombay. Polson, according to some sources not verified, supposedly allowed its cream to sour and large quantities of salt were added to it before it was processed into butter. In spite of enormous profits that the company made, it failed to benefit the Indian farmers. In an effort to help them, Amul was formed as a cooperative and used fresh cream to make their butter. When people still seemed to prefer Polson butter, Amul handed out gift coupons as an incentive, and we must have partaken of quite a large quantity of their butter to have earned that football.